So John, it's 5:15 in the morning and we're standing at Lillian Lynn's Light Pyramid in Milton Keynes, while the rest of the people who are celebrating sunrise on this glorious day are going to be at Stonehenge. So why the hell are we in Milton Keynes?
Well, for a start, we're doing exactly the same. You know, we're looking over the horizon and looking at the point that the sun rises on the longest day, which I think is the most southerly point on the horizon where the sun rises. We're just doing what they're doing, which is just what people have been doing for thousands of years. It's just Stonehenge is known for it. That's all it's known for. The fact that Milton Keynes was built in the 1960s under a fog of marijuana smoke and Pink Floyd records, and orientated to be a sun temple because of Watling Street being tilted the way it is. The whole of Watling Street was here first. The lovely grid structure of the Milton Keynes roads had to be fitted in with Watling Street, which meant that they don't run north, south, east, west. It means they're canted at an angle, pointing northeast, which means someone realised that they could align the entire town to the rising sun on the longest day.
Having journeyed through Canterbury and London in our 2 previous episodes, John and I make our slow ascent up the spine of England as Watling Street meanders through the home counties to the Midlands. After taking in the midsummer sunrise at Milton Keynes, we head to Bletchley Park to discuss issues of class and code-breaking and to celebrate one man absent from the recent spate of books and films, Tommy Flowers. Our final destination is Northampton, the epicentre of England, to meet its most celebrated resident, Alan Moore. Author, performer and wizard, Alan grew up in a working-class district of Northampton. As well as discussing how place and class shape his work, he reveals his surprising role in the building of Milton Keynes.
We have wandered too far from some ancient totem, something central to us that we have misplaced and must find our way back to.
Episode 3, In Search of the Omphalos.
So it's 4:23 in the morning, which is a time that actually exists. And we're driving through about 4,000 roundabouts to catch the rising sun on Midsummer Day. Because that's a normal thing to do. That's what people on this island have done. That's thousands of years since people built Stonehenge. We pay attention to the longest day in the summer.
But rarely did they come to Milton Keynes.
I don't really think Milton Keynes is in the forefront of most people's minds when they're looking for a midsummer sun temple. But that's what it was built for. That's what it was designed for. So we are honouring the original wishes of the architects of Milton Keynes.
Roundabout sculpture?
Yeah.
Never a good thing. We've parked in a car park. John's actually going to pay for the parking at 4:32 in the morning, which I think is money not well spent. So we just walked under a concrete bridge through a circular sculpture with a giant, what looks like an acorn in the middle and different posts. And now we're heading down a long concrete path to a pyramid. And it does kind of feel like we're in some retro sci-fi film. What do you know about the pyramid then, John?
It's quite recent, actually. There was a beacon there was just destroyed by lightning shortly afterwards. After they put a shopping centre over the alignment down in Midsummer Boulevard. 50 years ago, they'd be out. This would all be fields, and they would be out checking this alignment with ropes and sticks to check that this road was directly in line with the sunrise. And they realised, as they laid out the road, that there was this oak tree that was 100 years old then, 150 now, right in the middle. And so they didn't say, well, that'll have to go. They just went, no problem, we'll just rearrange our plans and have this sort of ancient English oak at the very heart of this city that is a sun temple. But that was in the rather more utopian thinking of the late 1960s. By the time the city was opened, as it were, by the time, in fact, it was Margaret Thatcher came to open at what was the original shopping centre in the middle. The idea that Milton Keynes was a sort of a state developed plan to house 250,000 people from the post-war baby boom. That seemed to be all forgotten. And Milton Keynes was seen in terms of the 80s as being about commerce and the future and shops, lots of shops. And so when Margaret Thatcher opened the shopping centre, she was praising the spirit of the private sector, despite the fact that the entire town only exists because it was planned and coordinated by a central state.
There's about 10 people gathered now. There's a chap in a Wonder Stuff t-shirt with a large carved pole. Lady with a white blanket wrapped around her who's brought a yoga mat, and some men with beards.
And us.
Well, there's some beautiful streaks of orange across the sky. There it is. It's a really deep red as well, isn't it?
Well, because it's so low to the horizon, the sun just looks huge.
It does.
Oh, that's lovely. This road directly ahead is Midsummer Boulevard, and this is directly in line with that rising sun on Midsummer Day, hence the name. And either side of Midsummer Boulevard are, I think, Avery Boulevard and Silbury Boulevard. And these are names that go back to, our pre-Celtic past, really, our really ancient Neolithic past.
Deliberate nod and a reference.
Very much so. As I understand it, there was a book by John Michel of The View Over Atlantis, which was a huge deal in the 1960s. It was about, earth mysteries and stone circles and artificial mounds like Silbury Hill and ley lines and things like that. And this was a big thing to the counterculture in the 60s. This sort of connection to an ancient past that's kind of been lost. By some reckoning, this is the beginning of summer rather than the middle of it. You can define these things how you like.
Yeah.
But it is a special day.
So do you think the people of Milton Keynes know? Is it generally known here that this is in alignment with the sun? Or do you think it's overlooked?
It's a good question. It's a good question. When you consider how few people turn up for it, you wonder if it's slightly occult knowledge, it's slightly hidden and secret knowledge. I mean, once you know about the alignment, it becomes quite prominent in the way you think about Milton Keynes, and because the roads are called things like Midsummer Boulevard and Silbury and Avebury and and things like that. And because it's got these strange pyramids pointing here and there, and because the whole layout is so sort of designed around it, it seems hard to overlook. It seems hard to forget.
So is this the heart of Milton Keynes then, this road?
Very much so, yeah. This is very much the heart of Milton Keynes. And of course this means we're exactly 6 months from Christmas. Christmas is the celebration, which is 3 days away from the winter solstice, which is exactly the opposite side of the year in the wheel of the year.
So Christmas Day would have been celebrated in terms of the return of the sun.
Absolutely, because a solstice means standstill. The sun stands still. And at this time of year, both solstice, the winter and the summer solstice, the sun seems to rise at the exact same point for 3 days. Normally it rises at a slightly different point on the horizon every day. When it gets to the extremes of these, it seems to stop and stand still and rise in the same place for 3 days. So Christmas is celebrated 3 days after the winter solstice, because when the sun has visibly started moving again, it's when the sun has returned.
Hello, we here for the sunrise.
Yeah.
And do you know much about the pyramid and Sunset Boulevard?
I know it was based on the sun rising for the solstice. It's I've been asked by the Parks Trust to sort of come up and get some images.
Right.
So I've literally taken from the railway station right the way up.
Oh, wonderful! And you got the sun as well.
I did, yes.
What luck!
Yeah. So I came up yesterday morning for a trial run.
Yeah.
But a bit hazy, so I thought I'd better come up here on the real day.
Right.
So longest day of the year, and
do you know? Is it well known in Milton Keynes about the sunrise alignment?
Do you know? I've been in Milton Keynes since 1975, and I didn't know until yesterday.
How strange!
No way.
Yeah. All right.
Great, nice chat with you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
From the fens to the shoreline, the lakes and the moors, a wilder garden with no borders. Had children with golden hands, stone and earth lay their temples for a serpent sun, the moon and the stars, the blood of a beating heart. The rains came in autumn.
Someone is writing down German bomber coordinates.
To cool the earth.
This is Bletchley Park. It happened here.
The veins of the land cut deeper.
A group of people that no one knows about or has even heard of is also listening. Listening to something quite different. The sound of secrecy. Of secrecy. Of secrecy. Of secrecy.
So do you want to tell us where we are?
Yes, well, we're at Bletchley Park, and if we move away from the lake, we walk up to a Victorian country estate, a very sort of odd house in many ways. It's been sort of had bits done to it at various times, in various styles for various reasons. It's a bit of a weird little sort of Frankenstein building. It's got sort of a copper dome on the left for some reason. It's got these very stern pillars out the front. It's a bit of a hodgepodge sort of thing. But it's about the only thing that we've seen today that would have been around in the 19th century. All of Milton Keynes, of course, didn't exist. And this place, when it went up for sale in, I think it was 1937, it was just with acres and acres and acres of land. All these huts you see behind us weren't built into the 1940s. Because, of course, this place was bought by the government code and cipher school because they knew a war was coming. And they knew there would be a lot of code breaking needed. And they knew they couldn't remain in London where they were because that would be continuously bombed. So they wanted somewhere that nobody would pay any attention to, really. Bletchley was just sort of an out-of-the-way little country village, but had good train links to Cambridge, to Oxford, to London. And so they bought this place. And it was all very upper class to start with. You know, they had a chef from the Ritz come in and all the food was served, silver service, which is not how you kind of think of food in the rationing of the Second World War. It was a very sort of upper class world, and it was a lot of the hiring was done from I've got friends in the right families. You know, there's a sense that these people they're the right type of people. You know, they'll be able to keep a secret to the extent that they almost didn't hire mathematicians like Alan Turing, because mathematicians and engineers were sort of deemed to be the wrong sort. Right? They were looking for classicists, professors of ancient Hebrew, linguists, because that was the most acceptable sort of face of education. Maths, engineering, they were linked to trade, they were linked to work, and so they were sort of looked down upon. And you can sort of imagine how different the world would be if they refused to hire Alan Turing because they sneered at him. If we walk over here, just in front of the house, there's this stone. It's the unobtrusive stone, and this is where Churchill stood. I think I'm going to stand on it myself. I'll be Churchill. When he came to address everyone here, Churchill was just, of course, enamoured of this place. It was the goose that laid the golden eggs and never cackled, as he put it. And it's that sort of image of Churchill standing on this rock, facing this Victorian country estate, has become one of our sort of go-to images of World War II. It's kind of interesting. Most of the stories we like to tell about that period paint us very much as the underdog. It's like the Dunkirk story, or we like the Battle of Britain and things like that. It's only more recently that the story of Bletchley Park, of Turing, of all the code breakers has become known really in the late 70s. And even when I was growing up in the 70s and the 80s, the idea that being smart, being clever, knowing maths, being able to crack codes was in some way admirable. Right? Didn't really exist, that idea. It was something to be sort of ashamed of. You'd be mocked for it. But now in the 21st century, we're quite happy to sort of applaud, cleverness. The geeks have won, the nerds have won in some way.
So you're saying geek chic started here, did it?
Well, I mean, it's pretty, if you're going to affect the fate of the future of the Western world to the extent that the mathematicians who worked here did, that's pretty cool, whichever way you face it, Should we go in? Yeah.
That's the sound, that's not Morse code.
So we're inside the house now.
Yeah, yes. And in the front rooms, they've got the bill of sale sort of framed, the 1937 bill of sale framed to put on the wall, and it's kind of a lovely image of the time, really. It says nearly a mile of frontage to the main Birmingham Road, in brackets Watling Street. Important freehold residential agriculture and building property known as the Bletchley Park Estate, extending to about 581 acres. The modern mansion, pleasure grounds and parklands. It sounds very, very sort of beautiful, but the things that they stress, I think over here it sort of says things like, if we look here, it says hunting. The estate is exceptionally well placed in an important hunting district. This is the centre of the Wadden Chase, whose kennels are close by, and the Duke of Grafton's, Bicester and Otley hunts are all within easy reach. This is This is
there's your priorities.
Yeah, there's your priorities. But notice up here, it does say from Bletchley Station, there's a frequent service of trains to and from London, which is 7 hours journey, and it is within a few yards of the principal shops. So things like that are eternal.
There are individual combats which bear ample witness to the gallantry and the daring of those young men who take part in them.
What we're looking at here in the library of Bletchley Park, they've got rows and rows of desks, each with a chair, each with a typewriter, each with a telephone, each with an ashtray. This is the analogue internet. We're sort of walking around inside the analogue internet, the pre-digital world. This is how information shuttled about. This is how information was processed. It isn't really that different to what we do today. It's just we hadn't had people like Turing, we hadn't had people like Tommy Flowers who'd come along and invent the sort of digital machines that we now take for granted, that we have in our pockets as tiny telephones, you know.
We have wandered too far. We have wandered too far.
So, as I type here, you'll see that the lights for the key-reels advance with each character. But for the side-reels...
So we're actually walking towards Hut 8, which I suspect is this one, because this is where Turing's office was. And Alan Turing is, of course, the most famous of all the code breakers here, after things like the film Imitation Game with Benedict Cumberbatch and his role in the sort of Turing's Law, the removal of the pardoning of people convicted of historic homosexual offences. He's a great British hero, is Turing. If we go through here, I think I have his office exactly as it was in his day. And if you can look at the radiator, there's a tin cup chained. That was his tin cup, because they just used to nick his cup. They were like children. And, I've always known of Turing because back in the early 90s, I did a degree in computer science. And Turing was a huge figure in the development of computers, in the development of the concepts behind artificial intelligence. Computers used to be called Turing machines. A Turing machine was a sort of mathematical proof that a machine capable of following any instruction was possible. It's only by quirk of fate that we call them computers and not Turing machines now. He was a major figure, but this was regardless of his role, cracking the Enigma communications. We didn't know anything about that at all. It was only in the 70s and more so into the 80s that people who worked here started telling their stories. It's wonderful that Turing has been recognised. But there's other people who need to be recognised as well. And the more you dig into a story like this, you realise that it still has its secrets. It still has its hidden surprises for us all. And that's what I really love about this story is Tommy Flowers' work. Tommy Flowers is not a name that's known to pretty much anyone, really. And it's a real shame because the number of British computer pioneers that most people might have heard of. There's not many. There's Tim Berners-Lee, there's Alan Turing. You can go back to Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage if you like. Maybe you want to throw in Sir Clive Sinclair if you're feeling generous. No one puts Tommy Flowers on that list, but Tommy designed and built the first digital programmable computer, a sort of computer as we'd recognise it now. It's not as programmable as what we'd call now, but it was still a programmable digital computer. And he did it off his own back. He presented the plans to people at Bletchley Park, but they looked down on Tommy because Tommy was a sort of a self-made East London guy, right? He learned engineering at night school. He was from the East End of London. He was the opposite of the Oxbridge set that sort of worked here, and they just dismissed him. And they said, "Oh, that won't work. We're not interested in that." These designs he had, and so he went back he worked at the post office, and he said, "Well, we'll build it anyway." And he spent best part of a year, him and his team, funding it out with their own money to a large extent, creating the world's first digital programmable computer because he knew Bletchley Park would need it later. And he was right. And when it was finished, it was brought here, and it did solve a lot of the what they called the Tunney ciphers. This was a new cipher that the Germans started using, which was unbreakable by the bomb machines that Turing had built. And this was leading up to D-Day, so they really needed to interpret and decrypt all the sort of high-ranking Nazi communication, which were in this Tunney cipher. So it was Tommy Flower's machine, which he just built out of stubbornness, that was able to do that. That's what reassured that Churchill and Roosevelt that the D-Day landings could go ahead as planned, and they hadn't been rumbled. And Tommy, he's just forgotten. He's just not known by anyone. He couldn't talk about his work here. After the war, he was just sort of sent back to the post office. And, he tried to then again build a new computer and say, look, we should build computers. He was the only person in the world who could do it. And he would go to banks to raise money for this, and they'd go, don't be ridiculous, that can't be done. And he couldn't say that he'd already done it. And he had to sort of sit back and watch as there was an American computer called ENIAC, ENIAC, that became recognised in the post-war world as the first digital programmable computer, and that went into all the history books. And he just had to sit back and listen, and he's very much a forgotten figure, is poor Tommy. But, it was in the post-war period, Britain was a pioneering force in computers, in the development of computers, especially at Manchester University. A lot of people from here at Bletchley Park went up to Manchester University, Turing included. But someone like Tommy Flowers, with all the expertise he had, with all the sort of brilliance and the engineering practical sort of brilliance, it's hard to imagine what development of computing in Britain would be like if he had been included in that post-war party, and not sort of excluded on the ground that he was basically a self-taught East End Cockney everyman.
Now the issue of class keeps coming up in this particular episode.
For me, I found the issue of class kept coming up during this stretch of Watling Street through the Midlands, through Mercia as it used to be. You keep coming across the notion that there are brilliant people who are just sort of excluded on the grounds that they're not the right type. You see this in people like Alan Moore, right, who aren't really appreciated, for the work they do by the sort of wider establishment, by the sort of wider media. People who read Alan Moore, they know he's, one of the most important British writers living. I don't think there's any doubt about that. He's changed the comics industry in the way that Shigeru Miyamoto of Nintendo changed the video games industry, in the way that Lennon and McCartney changed the pop music industry. He's that important. But because he's such a working class, stubborn Northamptonshire guy, he doesn't move in the circles that would elevate him in the national sort of consciousness to the genius that he is. You get this in Stratford with where William Shakespeare was from, Stratford-upon-Avon. There's so much talk, so many theories, so many conspiracies that Shakespeare couldn't have written all those plays, all that work of genius, because of his background, right? Because he was uneducated. They could only have been written by someone of higher class. There had to be a lord. Failing that, maybe about 6 lords, whichever theory you particularly follow. But the notion that a regular British person can be a genius if they're not part of the right set comes up again and again in this part of Watling Street, and it's such a shame, because you see, because things like creativity, intelligence, tenacity, right? These things are spread across the population of young people. These things sort of pop up. They're not all focused in the children of people who work in the city. The notion that we educate people based on their parents' income rather than them is a real loss to this country. We're losing people, like Alan Moore, like Tommy Flowers to a great deal. We're not sort of embracing them to the extent that we could. And I think everyone in the country now can imagine, a black prime minister, can imagine a woman prime minister very easily. You can imagine a gay prime minister. But who can imagine a poor prime minister?
me, this is the area that I was born into. And myself and my family were moved out of it in around 1970 when the progressive destruction of the boroughs had reached a kind of a tipping point. They had put up these two huge tower blocks that you see looming at the top of the street here. Back when they were put up, we were awestruck because it was like suddenly living in New York. We'd never seen a 12-storey building before. We thought they were amazing. We didn't actually realise that they were kind of two headstones that were being erected over our neighbourhood. This neighbourhood has become more fascinating to me the longer I've been away from it. The destruction of this neighbourhood first began, as far as I can work out, in around about 1918, when the soldiers were just coming back from war. My grandfather's amongst them. And they came home to find that their neighbourhood was being pulled down. No apparent reason. And that was the beginning of the demolishment of the boroughs. And I think probably because in 1918, yes, we'd all been a bit distracted by the First World War, but there'd been equally or possibly more important things happening in Russia in 1917. So all of the Western powers were terrified at the idea of having a group, a community of working class people all in the same area. That suddenly didn't seem like such a good idea anymore because, well, what if it went the same way as Russia had gone? So I believe that from then they were starting to break up the working class in the boroughs, and I suppose, in effect, the working class in general. It's so this place, although, yes, it's also full of very happy childhood memories. This is where I used to play. This is where a lot of my important relationships started. But sort of, it's also overlaid with the social reality of the boroughs and what it symbolises. It was always, even when I was growing up here, it was the poorest area of the town. And before that, it had been the whole of the town.
Well, as I know this area from fiction primarily, from Alan's novel, from Jerusalem, so it's very odd experience to enter a world that you associate with the immaterial, to walk past street signs that are loaded with meaning and importance. Think, my God, is this really Scarlet Well Street? To find, well, it's the centre of the country. The notion that this is the centre of England, that the arches of the English imagination would have been directly above us, that all came sort of crashing down as the novel sort of establishes it. But to see it, it reminds me a lot of the place I grew up in, a place called Buckley in North Wales, which looked very, very much similar to this. But no one's enchanted Buckley in the way that Alan's enchanted this place. No one's added the level of meaning to it that this place has. It's a very weird experience to walk around an area you know from fiction. It's like it's materialised for you. It's like you're on a tour at the Harry Potter studios and you can go around Hogwarts or something like that.
And where does this fit in within the broader story of Watling Street?
Well, it's just within the. I had this 5-mile limit on when I did my journey along Watling Street. I was never to go more than 5 miles from Watling Street, and the boroughs was just within that. And I thought, oh, that's excellent, that's great, because Alan, you live just outside that 5 miles thing, and I was troubled by this, you see, but because the boroughs is just within. Alan, can I ask you about the importance of place in your practice of creativity? I mean, if when you were say 5, if your family had decided let's up and move to Ipswich, how different do you think the work you'd be producing now?
I don't know whether I would feel such a connection with the place, given that 3 or 4 generations of my family, at least, have lived here on the various sides of the family. I'm sure that there's always been ancestors of mine probably around the boroughs since its earliest times. People didn't tend to move very far back in the day, so I don't know. If I'd been transplanted, it would have obviously been completely different circumstances. I mean, I owe my current situation to a lot of, at the time, hideous accidents. Being excluded from school when I was 17, that was a massive influence upon my subsequent life. But also coming from the boroughs. I think I came from the school that was here, Spring Lane School, which was a lovely little red brick school. Probably terribly underfunded, but you were made to feel kind of welcome. They were doing their best in a difficult neighbourhood. I was moved from there to the grammar school, which, the grammar school process, the 11 plus, it was explained by another Burroughs boy, Jeremy Seabrook, who wrote a brilliant book called The Unprivileged, which was, I think, the first work on post-war poverty in England. Now, Jeremy Seabrook, he was born in Green Street, the same place that my paternal grandmother used to live, the Deathmonger. And he was very eloquent about what had happened to this neighbourhood, and he was talking about the grammar school system, because oddly he ended up as my French teacher when I was 11. But he was saying about how the 11 plus system was meant to cream off the very best of the working class and give them a leg up into the middle class, rather than so that they could escape from neighbourhoods like this, rather than return to them and try to help them. So if I hadn't lived here, I probably wouldn't have shoulders that are almost entirely made of chip. And that would have perhaps taken a vital fuel from some of my work. Did I tell you my Brexit poem?
No.
That I wrote. I wrote this verse the moment that I heard the good news that we'd got our language back, whence I, in a misjudged racial attack, kicked out French, German and Italian words, and then I...
Aliens who were lost in space, needing help from the human race, and they found new energy at Northampton. Northampton, 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 England. Northampton, 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 England.
Alan, in creating Jerusalem, you have amassed an incredible amount of historical knowledge and love and compassion that goes into your book for place and for all the characters in it. Is there an element of taking a place into somewhere ideal where no one else can get hold of it?
Yes,
and
there certainly is. Because that is one of the only things that effectively we can do. I think that I, as a thought experiment, was just thinking once, okay, so what would make you happy about the way that the boroughs was treated? If they suddenly said, look, Alan, we're ever so sorry for what we did to the boroughs, we want it to sort of be just how it was again, we're going to build it right down to the last doorstep, it's going to be rebuilt exactly as you remember it. No, that would be horrible. That would be horrible because it would be false. It wouldn't actually be the place. Those places have gone. However, I've saved them in the ship in the bottle sense, that I've saved all of those moments, all of those people, all of those streets by enclosing them within the bottle of Jerusalem, of prose, of narrative, in a form that, art is as eternal as we are. No, it probably won't last till the end of the universe, but it will probably last as long as we do. And that is a kind of longevity that, yes, that makes sense to me. That makes emotional sense, whereas rebuilding the boroughs, no, that wouldn't make emotional sense.
What's your perspective of Dickens then? Do you think Dickens, in his books, was writing stories of characters trying to escape their certain fates? Or do you think there was an element of a return and helping?
Well, I think that, Dickens is an odd one. He's a tremendous writer. I think that by publicising these conditions, by dramatising the life of the lower classes, yes, he was getting something out of it as well, but he was also drawing attention to conditions that a lot of people had probably ignored or been prepared to ignore up until that point. Mind you could say much the same thing about Jack the Ripper. I believe that George Bernard Shaw, at the height of the Ripper murders, said, "This is ridiculous. All of us well-intentioned public kind of figures have been trying without any success at all for years to bring people's attentions to the plight of the poor, and now overnight some anonymous genius has done our work for us." But yeah, I think that Dickens deserves credit amongst his many other accomplishments for actually popularising the working class because his working class characters weren't all depraved, and his middle class characters weren't all benign. It was, and that in itself was quite a revolutionary statement back in Dickens' day. I think that he had an eye and an ear for the realities of life on a lower class than his own, you know. Of course, on the other hand, he was a middle-class ponce. But,
We have wandered too far. We have wandered too
far. Well, I did promise to conclude with revealing Alan Moore's role in building Milton Keynes. So here's John Higgs, followed by a recording of Alan live at Brighton Spiegel Tent in 2017.
Yeah, Alan Moore is one of the mythical builders of this town. Alan Moore was working for some gas board contractors in one of the few proper jobs he had in his life before becoming a full-time writer and artist. And he was in the office organising everything here, with people going out digging the trenches and laying down the gas mines and stuff like that. So he didn't do it single-handedly. As he says, he had some help. But, he did build this city.
what happened was, I was working as a subcontractor to the gas board in around about 1975, 1976, around then, when they were just actually building Milton Keynes. So I was working out there when it was just a load of slit trenches and depressed navvies and rain. And but I did have a part in the building of Milton Keynes. When I went there, when Josie Long, the comedian, was doing one of her kind of guerrilla performances with Arts Emergency, where she'd sort of take a bus full of performers around the country. She'd alert the audience by Twitter, and then she'd perform the gig for nothing in a windy car park. So I was there at Milton Keynes. There were about 15 people in the audience. So I came on and I was explaining about how I'd recently been reading in New Scientist. Somebody had put forward the theory that in the next 20 years, we are very definitely going to create a quantum supercomputer. Now, a quantum supercomputer can handle so many bits of information that it can handle more bits of information than there are particles in the known universe, right? So that means that, basically we will be able to simulate a universe including simulated life forms that do not know that they are simulated. If we're going to be able to do that in the next 20 years, the odds against that being the first time that this has happened are vanishingly small. So the greater probability is that we are in a simulation, in a simulation, in a simulation, in a simulation, and so on for several hours. So what do we do about that? Because the person who is operating this simulation, who is playing this game in the next universe up, is effectively God to us. The best practical thing to do, firstly, don't be boring, because boring characters are always weeded out of the game really early on. So, be evil if you want, but just don't be boring, And then he said also, God, or the person playing this simulation, if he has, or she has a similar ego structure to us simulations, then they will probably be playing this game. It said that they wouldn't go for anything obvious, like, say, President of the United States, for obvious reasons, They'd probably go for somebody who was really admired, but wasn't such a high-grade celebrity. Now, as I said to this freezing and bewildered 15 people in this kind of small, windy enclosure in Milton Keynes, I said, I don't think that is enough of a criteria to decide whether the person that you're talking to is God or not, because a lot of celebrities are horrible. I said that what you should really look for is a celebrity who kind of both looks and perhaps sounds like your personal idea of God. But I said even that is not enough. People of Milton Keynes, I said that this is not enough, because that could mean that you end up worshipping any tramp, basically. It's... So I said, what you should ask yourself, people of Milton Keynes, is, does the person that you're looking at appear to have physically created the world around you? And I said, in your case, people of Milton Keynes, yes, I did. And so that is why I'm still regarded as a deity by the primitive and superstitious people of Milton Keynes.
Watling Street podcast was presented by David Bramwell and John Higgs and was produced by David Bramwell. The book Watling Street is published by Weidenfeld and Nicholson and is available from all good bookshops, especially those within a 5-mile radius of the A2 and the A5. Music and the title track Watling Street was by Oddfellows Casino and features on their latest album O Sealand, which is well worth spending your pocket money on. To find out more about John and David, visit drbramwell.com and johnhiggs.com. Further podcasts featuring the dynamic duo can be found on Auditorium Podcast at oddpodcast.com. This podcast was funded by Arts Council England. If you liked it, please leave a review for us on iTunes.